Our education has two hands. And like two hands, they can be made to work together. Generally, in the world that we live in, people try to do everything with just one hand. They have a preference for one hand or the other. Whereas our education is meant to introduce and to discipline and to maintain two hands, an ambidextrousness, so that we don't favor one hand or the other. The two hands can be called by symbolic names. We'll call the left hand the Shaman, and we'll call the right hand Picasso. And the name of today's lecture will be Picasso and the Shaman, or how to use art and ritual together to give us a really in-depth focus and give our activities in life a lot of, let's not use the term power, let's use the term oomph, so that our activities have a lot of oomph. If you put both hands to some task, you can do a lot more. And so what we're after in our education is to make ourselves comfortable with ambidextrousness in terms of the world, in terms of our own capacities. Now, the left hand is the hand that brings things together. And in bringing things together, it bases itself on nature. The right hand, on the other hand, the right hand likes to take things apart, and it bases itself on an interior vision. So the left hand is natural, the right hand is visionary. The left hand is the Shaman, the right hand is Picasso. The right hand is an artist, real, universal, creative artist. And because a real, universal, creative artist has powerful capacities to bring something new into play, something that was not there in nature, very often the right hand, the artist, Picasso, seems opposite to the left hand, the Shaman, the master of nature. Now, why the Shaman? Because the Shaman is a symbol. He's the symbolic agent of a nature whose full extent is mysterious, that the full capacities of nature are not known, that nature is mysterious, and indeed nature is very mysterious. When we reduce nature to some kind of diagrammatic frame of reference, it becomes easy for us to think that we can plumb its depths and manipulate it. If you put a CD-ROM on the planets into a computer and you get on your screen an image of the solar system, you can manipulate that and click various places, and you think that the solar system is a very neat place which you can close out by another click. But that CD-ROM image on the screen is dwarfed into the finest dust imaginable. If you were in a spaceship like Voyager on the edge of our solar system, and you could look back and you would see the vastness of what really is a very mediocre star system in terms of this universe. Our wonderful star, our sun, is very middle class. When you look up tonight and you see the constellation of Orion, in the upper left of Orion, that bright yellow star, which has a wonderful name of Betelgeuse. Can you imagine? Don't say it 3 times. If Betelgeuse was where our star is, the outer surface of it would be at the orbit of Mars. It is catastrophically huge. But even in our mediocre star system, looking back from Voyager, one would see an enormous movement of planets and stars and moons around the planet. And in fact, from Voyager, you would be far enough out now that you would be able to look forward and you could see an invisible dark sheen that blots out the starlight in a whole huge arc. And this sheen is something which almost no one has ever seen. Only in the last 2 years have we come to understand that a couple, in fact 4, bodies that have been astronomically located have come from that sheen. And that sheen is a disk. It's called the Kuiper disk, named for Gerard Kuiper, who was a great astronomer who did a number of atlases. We have his huge photographic lunar atlas from the University of Chicago Press, which before the Apollo missions was the greatest universal map ever made. The Kuiper disk holds about 75% of the matter in our star system, and we've never even seen it. It has hundreds of thousands of bodies the sizes of moons, and apparently Pluto and Charon, the farthest planets, are members of the Kuiper disk that have been slowly eked out by the gravity of Neptune over several billion years. Of the 4 objects that we've seen, they're comets that never come any closer to the sun than the orbit of Saturn, and never go further out than the orbit of Neptune. And they also have been brought in so that the gravity of Neptune brings them into its orbit, and then the gravity of Uranus brings it into its orbit, and the gravity of Saturn into its orbit, and eventually Jupiter brings them further in. And when they get that far in, they become elliptical around the sun and they become comets. And there are hundreds of thousands of comets, most of them so large that if they hit any planetary body, they would simply fracture it, disintegrate it. One of the objects found last year is called Chiron, and it's a comet the size of the state of New Hampshire. And it would simply pulverize any planet that it hit, including Jupiter. So the actual universe is fabulous. It is fabulous. And so the image that men and women used to have of the universe before they got used to this reductive screen of CD-ROM images that are easy to manipulate by clicks, they used to be in awe of nature. And that's why the shaman was a person of power, because the shaman knew the mystery of the universe, could go into the mystery of the universe and come back into the life of the tribe. The shaman could go into the mystery and come back into tribal life. And so he's very powerful. And that was the left hand. On the right hand, the great universal artist was equally powerful to the shaman, because the great universal artist could go into the mystery that was at the other end, not the mystery of nature so much, but the mystery of the cosmos. Because in a differential energy, one does not have a universe, a one-verse, but one has a cosmos, like an omniverse. nature is a universe because it has a quality of oneness, that everything that manifests out of it has this quality of seeking to become what it is. And that quality is summed up in the relational energies of the electromagnetic spectrum and gravity. Gravity pulls together the arc of the electromagnetic spectrum into actuality. And so its motion is integral. Its motion is to come together. And so the left hand likes to bring things together. And because we exist originally from nature, our whole purpose initially is to come together, is to find our center, is to find a mutual center between us, is to bring things into being. And our first taste of what is real is what actually exists. That's what we like. That's what nature likes. Nature has a taste for the real in terms of existence. But a change happens from the left hand to the right hand. On the right hand, the taste changes. On the other hand, the taste is not for existence. The taste is for creative newness, something new, something that hasn't existed before. Let's have something new. And so one has a Picasso rather than a shaman. And the problem with education that has not been dealt with for 300 years, can you imagine? More than 300 years, actually. Closer to 350 years now. Can you imagine something so important that it has not been dealt with for 3.5 centuries in any kind of serious way? The last person to deal with this issue was a man named Comenius in the 1600s. And at that time, it was such a serious issue and recognized by everyone that the people supporting the development of that education were people like the King of Sweden, the power group that ran England, the German and Dutch and continental French intellectual communities, was sponsored by the powerful elite of the time. Because to them, they understood that if you don't get this right, nothing else we do will ever have any efficacy. It's like writing in the sand just before the tide comes in. And so it's very curious that 3.5 centuries later, the only support for this kind of endeavor are you people here. You're the kings. You are the elites who make something like this happen. Because this is the only education since Comenius that takes both hands seriously. That takes the shaman and Picasso both seriously. That both are necessary. That somehow the integral form of energy and the differential form of energy fit together and make a whole. And that we, as men and women who are realistic about ourselves and each other and about what we do, we'd like to have what we do be as real as possible, have some oomph in it. And if we put both hands together, then what we do is done. And in the ancient wisdom, the understanding was once something is done, really, it exists for all eternity. There never is any way for it not to be once it is in this joined way. And so every time someone comes to that transformational experience where they understand how both hands work, they then understand that when you bring both hands together, that's God's symbol. That's the way that works. And that's a blessing. And that blessing has its efficacy. And one can give and receive equally in that mode. Now, it's a curious thing that after 3.5 centuries, many forgetful generations have occurred. Many mistaught generations have occurred, so that it's almost impossible at this long, late date for someone to reach back into humanity's bag of experience and wisdom and find, by not being able to see it clearly, by only using the sense of touch, of recognizing that one is blind, and refining the sense of touch enough to pull out of a sheaf of dollar bills the $1 million bill that's in there, and do it simply by touch and bring it out and say, now we can go shopping. This is a Hollywood way of talking. You know, once you have $1 million bill, you can convince the merchants to sell you $10 million worth of goods. So it goes a long way. And when you have those, you can borrow $100 million against that as collateral. It's a wonderful world. Mr. Keynes was right. You know, we can spend what we don't have faster than what we do have. Excuse me. Sorry. Before Keynes was an economist, he was a logician, and a very good logician. Which brings us to the subject of today's lecture. Today's lecture is about logic and magic. Logic and magic. Logic is the left hand, oddly enough. Eh? That's the Canadian. Eh? The Quebec lumberjacks were fabulous because they didn't want to get along with the English overlords, and so they mastered this bedeviling single syllable. Eh? And so the English Canadian overlords would let them just be because they'd say you can't talk to them. The Front Liberation Quebec was very wise. They say today in a very interesting way. Eh? Logic is the left hand, magic is the right hand. Magic belongs with art, oddly enough. And logic belongs with the shaman, oddly enough. It's very peculiar. It's downright paradoxical. And you remember we were talking last week. We were saying that when your juices get going, when this education begins to get some traction in you, the very first thing that you notice in the second year, not in the first year at all, never comes up, but in the second year, the very first indication that the juices are flowing from this education is that you begin to develop a sense of irony. You start to notice things around you ironically. Look at that. Well, what do you think of that? And that when irony deepens, it becomes paradoxical. Instead of what do you think of that, it's how does that work? How does that happen? And irony can deepen and become something mystical called creative imagination. And when creative imagination, that's the English translation of the term that Ibn Arabi, the great Sufi of about 700 years ago, used. When creative imagination begins to work, one begins to pull out of that blind sack of humanity's treasures, whole stacks of $1 million bills. How do you think Picasso bought all those villas and those ladies? Attention. Because the really creative artiste makes not paintings and sculptures so much as themselves. And the person is the great work of art. What's the greatest work of art that Picasso made? Picasso. And all of the other works are Picasso's. And believe me that Senor Pablo knew that. They are mine, they are me. And so he didn't make tens of thousands of little Picassos just to make the dinero, but he made them because he was exuberantly real. Now, sometimes a great artist falls in love with paradox and doesn't go quite all the way to that depth of cosmos, which Picasso had. Sometimes you're like Senor Dali, who loved paradox more than himself. And instead of allowing himself to really be Dali, he loved the paradox that he was and wasn't Dali. And so he made thousands of yes and no Dalis. And he loved that. But you can never get to Perpignan on that kind of track. It's a Dali joke. Whereas Picasso really got to his villas. He really got there with the friends he wanted and did what he wanted to do. And even at 90 years of age, he was cutting up. He was making little Picassos everywhere, every day. Ask the villagers, they know, that can tell you those stories. The shaman, oddly enough, is associated with logic, and Picasso is associated with magic. The very first artists in history lived in an area which is today southern France, the Dordogne Valley. It's the first place that you find art in the world. Before that, you find symbolic pictograms in Australia, even when the Aborigine population 60,000 years ago first came over the land that is now the Sulu Sea from Indonesia. They brought with them the capacity to make symbolic pictographs. And one can still find those symbolic pictographs. But those are pictographs of a dream time. And they belong in shamanistic logic of the mysteries of nature. Whereas the Paleolithic, prehistoric cave art of southern France is really art. It's not of the dream time. It's of a world that is envisioned and made so by art. And so the first artists on the planet appear there, at least on this planet. Other planets will have to take care of their own traditions. We can't help the aliens out there yet. We're still sorting out our own. We'll help them later. I believe in the other way. It's not that they are helping us. It's that they're waiting for us to help them. I can't help it. I grew up in the United States when we were loaning everything to everybody. And I have that outlook. We'll loan it to them later. You see, I think that the UFOs are projective visions of our own capacities about 4 generations from now. Yeah. We see them now because we have the vision now. But they'll be there when our great-grandchildren are there. That's a goat outside. That's not some kind of banshee. Just to comfort you. I know sometimes people wander away and say, well, was that real? The answer is, yeah, there's a goat out there. That's a paradox also. Let's talk a little bit about the peculiarities of logic and magic, about the way in which the shaman and Picasso are related. They're related together. We mentioned last week that one of the peculiar qualities that operates in the differential mode as distinct from the integral mode, logic is an integrating, magic is a differentiating mode. The differentiating mode operates by correspondence. Correspondence. So that what's important in a differential way is similarity. Similarity is important. Whereas in logic, similarity will not do. What's important is identity. The whole thrust of an integral mode is making sure that A is A. You can't do anything without A being A. And not only must A be A, B must be B, and quite distinct from A, and C must be C. Notice, D must be D, and you have to be able to go through the entire alphabet, and because that's so very difficult, now I'm starting to mention Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse, somebody like Mr. Ramsey who says, well, I've got as far as Q. I know that Q is Q, but what about R? Well, nobody knows about R. But I would like to know about, is R R? If only we could get. Well, what happens if Mr. Ramsey gets so that R is R? Well, then there would be S. That's why, following Virginia Woolf, you had a very interesting kind of English literature. They got to R, and then S stood for shit. That's Hollywood, too. Loud and dirty so they hear it. Because even when you get to S, there's still T. And you know what? If you got to Z, there would be other alphabets. What can I tell you? It's a difficult process. Identity. Identity is exasperating and only works on limited conditions which found themselves on limited manifestations called existence. Identity as an actuality and as a process do not function without existence. Something has to be in order for it to even begin to suppose that it could operate. In a world where nothing exactly is, there can be no identity whatsoever. This is one of the bugaboos of realization. That's why a deep yogic, masterful meditation is so precarious. They never told you that in the brochures for the weekend enlightenment with guru, who knows? There probably is a guru who knows. 3-day intensive at Cancun. No bathing suit necessary. That's the S. I play sometimes. If I don't keep myself interested, I would leave. I have walked out of a lot of planets. Look at it this way. Identity is the ultimate coming together. Something is what it is. In similarity, one doesn't care whether it's exactly that or not. Close enough will do. Notice that opens up the universe. Instead of being a universe, it becomes an omniverse. It becomes an omniverse. Question. It's like Michael York and Logan's Run, right? Question? Almighty computer in the sky. What's an ankh? An ankh is where the bow is tied, linking together the one with the other. That integration and differentiation link together. They actually, well, it's like two hands, they come together. I was very curious how that happens, because the closer that they come together, it's like our eyesight, which is used to seeing this, or we can look and we can see this, that when they come together, our eyes cross. If we try to look at both together exactly at the same time, our eyes cross. Why do they cross? Because eyes are natural, and as long as they're in the natural world, they will cross. But as soon as we shift, instead of looking naturally through our eyes, we start to look with vision. We can see the two of them come together, because we can see with these same eyes, both naturally and visionally. But the vision is an inner seeing that is projected out and put out on the world. And we can do that. We can do that, and it seems very simple to us, and you can do it with grade school children, but you know, about 10,000, 20,000 years ago, almost no one could do that. There were no men and women who could do that. That was very peculiar. And for us, we don't understand anymore how titanically surreal we would be to those men and women back then. Just like men and women 20,000 years from now, 22,000, who knows what, they would be very surreal to us. Their natural, normal, mediocre, middle-class functioning would be almost unseeable by us. Literally, we would not be able to see how they function, how they are. Integration and differentiation fit together, but as they come together, the closer that they come together, there's a mystery right there at that center. Just like there's a mystery at the origin of things and a mystery at the end of things, there's a mystery, the same mystery, at the very center of things. So that if you were like nerd genius and you could get the goddamn thing on the screen and you could visualize it and get the diagram, it would be a torus. Human life capacities would be like a torus, has a hole in the center and has unknown extent outside the bounds. But it's a torus that tends mysteriously to want to come together, but at the exact center where it would come together, it doesn't register, and it's projectively known as a black hole. There's no such thing as a black hole. Yes, there are black holes, but they're not black holes. It's because the mind that currently exists cannot refine itself yet on a normal level to be able to see what is there. It doesn't register. Even though it's there, the mind simply doesn't register it. Why? Because there are no neuronal patterns, there are no nets yet in most people to function that finely and be there. Now, it doesn't take some UFO Superman to do that. One can, in fact, educate any number of people to do that. But you have to have an education that has two hands, not one hand. You can't focus at the center and get to realization with one hand or the other. It doesn't matter which one you prefer. It doesn't matter. From a one one-handed stance, you're never going to be able to clap. It's that simple. It's that fundamental. It's that real. What does that mean? What's the bottom line? The bottom line is that we're throwing money and time and lives away by having one-handed education as still the norm. And we're already in the third millennium of this kind of time scale. The calendars are out of date. It's not 1995, it's 2003. That's what date it is. We're already there, and we don't have a two-handed education even for more than 30 people. At 5.5 billion people, that's ridiculous. And that's just to begin. That's just for starters. Then they're still pushing up the sleeves and doing the work. The wonderful thing is that in the two-handed mode, one can make up for lost time in a hurry because what is done really happens. It's not just temporizing, make do, but something really happens. Children get fed and loved and housed. And they grow up caring for the fact that they would like their children to get fed and clothed and loved and housed. And it only takes a couple of generations like that, and men and women turn out to be fantastic. They put their hands around each other's shoulders and they make a line that's like God's finger drawing in the universe and saying, these things now exist. And when men and women like that make a society, that society stays. They can withstand the buffers of any kind of totalitarian metaphysics. But first the work. And before the work, there needs to be the education. That's how it works. It works because men and women understand each other. I remember a beautiful lecture one time about, I guess it was more than a quarter of a century ago. One of the fair-haired Vajrayana gurus, Chogyam Trungpa, had just come from England, was lecturing in Berkeley, and he was, in fact, it was his first lecture in the United States. It was 1960, early 69. He came out, and he had one of these kind of Pendleton plaid shirts that was outside, chino pants. And in one hand, he had a 2-liter Coke bottle. They were new in those days. And a cigarette in the other. And his hair was down like this. And he looked like a little boy. Came out, smiled a little bit, and he sat on one of these high stools. And he sat there, and then he started to talk, and it was like, what? Because he talked nonstop for about 2 hours and never lost his concentration once. When he was through, he got off his little chair and he left. And everyone said, did you hear that? And one of the things he said that evening, he said, people think that men fight each other because they don't understand each other, but they fight because they do understand each other and they don't agree. Things like that. They were just so, and then you thought, well, yeah, that's right. That's why we don't like those guys. We get what they're doing, and goddamn it, they're wrong. It's like that, yeah. So it's a question not of having peace because people will understand each other. No, that's not it. That's not the issue at all. They will have peace because they will work together. It's a slight change, fundamental. Towards the end of his life, William James, who was one of the greatest minds of the modern age, We think that Freud and Jung are the big psychologists, and it's William James who's the titan. Almost all of Jung's real great deep work comes from foundations and insights laid by William James. William James, who wrote the world's first textbook on psychology in 2 big fat volumes. Before that, there was no science of psychology. He made psychology a science. Towards the end of his life, he was speaking at Stanford University. And he had just started to finish up his book called A Pluralistic Universe. And he delivered a speech, and in it he said to the assembled people, 1910, he said, "Man will cease to have war and will have peace when he works as hard for peace as he does for war." So succinct, because it's what we actually are doing together that actually happens. We learned that in the first year when we did ritual, that one of the first ways to start changing your life is to be very, very truthful about what it is you're doing. Without being truthful, to yourself at least, what is it that we are doing? That is being done. And when one is attentive to that, you can stop this and it stops. You can do this and it gets done. And that little tiny revisioning process becomes enriching, because as you do that more and more, you begin to do what you really want to do, and you do not do what you don't want to do. And it's like somebody who's learning to sail, and they learn that you can tack with rudder and sail. And when you do that, lo and behold, the fundamentals of navigation have begun. And after a while, you can go outside the harbor and you can hit the high seas with impunity, as long as your boat holds together. And you can navigate. The old Polynesians used to just use the cosmic vision of the stars, and they could navigate from Tahiti to Hawaii. That's a lot of open sea. Do you know what the center of the Polynesian sky was? A star constellation. It was the constellation of the dolphin. And that's how they navigated the Pacific, by keeping the dolphin stars in the center of their vision. When the Spanish became enmeshed with the Polynesians, sometime after Magellan, the Spanish name for that constellation is Dorado. 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 And so the English-Spanish symbiosis in the Renaissance put together the fact that in the ancient West, the sky constellation that was at the center of the vision was called L. And on the other side of the planet, the sky constellation that was always at the center of vision was called Dorado. And so they thought, putting them together, you would get the axis of the whole planet, and they called that El Dorado. So they went in search of El Dorado. That's the real gold. When you understand this planet, it not only holds together, but it sings. That's what this education is about. I'd love to be able to say that you could get it elsewhere. I'm not sure. Let's come back to left hand and right hand. Let's come back to the Shaman and Picasso. Let's come back to logic and magic. Logic works because identity holds. Magic works because similarity holds. And similarity used to be called sympathy. And sympathy is the foundation of magic, just like logic has its foundation in identity. Identity and sympathy. And somehow those two are related together in such a very peculiar way that they only really come together in realization. Realization is a magical logic, or a logical magic. It's totally paradoxical. It can go either way. In fact, you can make a nice little ultimate square of logical magic and magical logic, and in that final parenthesis is the moment of whatever that is, whatever name you want to give that. The soul. In ancient China, the Taoist esoterics used to say that you can always tell someone who's universal because they have square pupils in their eyes. That's what they meant. Yeah. And when somebody who's on either side of that looks into the eyes of someone who has square pupils, all they see is an open frame of reference. That's why in Chinese Chan, in original Zen, there's a famous saying by Huang Po, who was a Tang Dynasty Zen master when Japan was still wearing fishermen's diapers. Huang Po said, when two Zen masters look at each other, it's like two open doors facing each other. Only the wind blows. There's this quality that somehow identity and sympathy fit together in the soul. But other than that, they tend to be inversely proportional to each other, and that's the problem of human life. Let's take a break. This is from ancient Mesopotamia, and this is an image of wide-eyed looking. And this wide-eyed looking has a capacity to maintain vision. Good, that's fine. There was a name for this wide-eyedness, and to use the referent that was operative 500 years ago for it, I'm going to read a few words from a book. Its title is Oration on the Dignity of Man, and it's by Pico della Mirandola, one of the great Renaissance philosophers, who was extremely handsome for you ladies. He was unbelievably beautiful. He was like a living Botticelli man, his physique. And he was the young prince from the Italian city-state, Mirandola, and he was swashbuckling, and in his 20s he went to Florence to study at the Platonic Academy. It wasn't exactly in Florence, it was up by Fiesole, up along the rim of the mountains, just around Florence. And up there was a villa called the Via Carreghi, and it has a yellow stucco. Still today, 500 years later, has yellow stucco. It was owned by Cosimo de' Medici. It's now owned by Lawrence Rockefeller. And Cosimo, being paterfamilias of the Renaissance, said to Ficino, here's this estate, you use it well, train a generation of our compatriots so that Florence will live in the memory of man like Athens. And so he did. It's as simple as that. If you give the right person the facility, they do it. And Pico came to study with Ficino, and he was such a genius. He was so swashbuckling and fantastic. He was like a Valentino in the intellect. Mm-hmm. And so he wrote out 900 issues that he had with the church and literally posted them in town and said, I'll argue with anybody on any one of these issues anytime. And of course, the power structure takes you up on that, right? They go to work on you right away. Well, where's his financing? But before they went to work on him, he wrote this beautiful little, well, actually he didn't write it, he delivered it, because it's an oration. An oration means that he spoke, and then people, scribes, wrote it down. Oration on the dignity of man. And in Oration on the Dignity of Man, he talks about this quality. He talks about the wide-eyedness. And the Greek word for the wide-eyedness is the one that Pico uses. He's speaking Italian, but he said this word in Greek because he could read Greek. He could speak Greek. Because Ficino had taught him very well. Ficino was the great translator of Plato and the Hermetic treatises and Plotinus and just everything that made the Renaissance real. He says, Pico says, in characteristic flamboyant, he's about 27 years old. He says, in fact, however, the dignity of the liberal arts, this is 500 years ago, the dignity of the liberal arts, which I am about to discuss, and their value to us is attested not only by the Mosaic and Christian mysteries, but also by the theologies of the most ancient times. That is to say, before there was a Judaism, before there was a Christianity, there was a universal understanding of these mysteries. Well, who was there before Abraham? About 1900 BC. Who was there before him? Well, for one, the Mesopotamians were there, the ancient Sumerians. This image is from the Treasuries of Darkness, a history of Mesopotamian literature. So this is like from about 6,000 years ago. Wide-eyed. Why wide-eyed? Pico says, 500 years ago, by the theologies of the most ancient times, what else is to be understood by the stages through which the initiates must pass in the mysteries of the Greeks? These initiates, after being purified by the arts, which we might call expiatory, moral philosophy, and dialectic, were granted admission to the mysteries. What could such admission mean but the interpretation of occult nature by means of philosophy? Only after they had been prepared in this way did they receive, and this is where wide-eyedness comes in, epopteia. Epopteia. That is the immediate vision of divine things by the light of ancient theology. Not theology of Christianity or of Judaism or even of Sumerian religion, but ancient, direct vision by the light of vision. Direct seeing by the light of visionary wholeness. Now, the Greek word is not the word that was there in ancient Sumerian, but the Greek word epopteia, wide-eyedness, comes from the clan. In ancient Greece, families were held together for centuries and millennia, and they were clans. And the clan who were in charge of the Eleusinian mysteries, to host it, to keep it pure, to make sure that it was exactly what it was, that clan was called the Epoptai, and so out of that clan name came the wide-eyed vision of the real. That you cannot see the real completely in nature, but you can see the real completely in vision. And so the wide eyes do not look at anything in this world, but they look at the reality of God's wholeness. And so that is why this wide-eyedness. And Pico, at the very height of the Renaissance, when it was white hot, in the Oration of Dignity of Man, says that when one is initiated finally into the real mysteries, one experiences this wide-eyedness Plato has Socrates say that philosophy begins with this sense of wonder. This aha. Philosophy is the love of wisdom. One has to be a lover of wisdom. Wisdom is feminine, and one must love her. There is no one else but you, and for you I will sing. Every word of my being is the song I offer. This kind of love of wisdom has nothing to do, with philosophy departments in the modern world. I'll leave out the expletives. Our sponsors don't like that. But later on in the oration, Pico comes to it and he says, Plotinus also gives signs that he was aware of it in the passage in which he shows that the magician is the minister of nature and not merely its artful imitator. This very wise man approves and maintains this magic while so abhorring that other, a different kind of a magic, a regressive magic, a black magic. While abhorring that other, that once, when he was invited to take part in the rites of evil spirits, he said they ought to rather come to him than he go to them. There's no sense in taking a real wisdom tradition on the road in a world that's a junkyard. You have to find your way there. That's the way that works. In a real world, you're glad to pack up your pack and go. But in a junkyard, there's no place to go. Plotinus in his time was already so corrupt. He taught in Rome. He taught in his own house. This is an ancient tradition, teaching in your own house. You teach where you live. That's the wisdom tradition. Wherever it is that you live, that's where you teach. Milarepa lived in the Himalaya mountain range, and so he taught at Mount Everest. I live in Los Angeles. I teach here. I'm no Milarepa, but Los Angeles is no Himalaya. It's all in proportion. The only advantage is that Milarepa has been gone for 1,000 years, and I'm dealing. Another card. Plotinus, when he was teaching in Rome, received many people into his house. The Roman Emperor Aurelian and Aurelian's wife were students of Plotinus, as well as about 70 of the members of the Roman Senate of the day. This is in the 250s, 260s AD. There was a visitor from Alexandria, an Egyptian magician, an occult master. And he offered to, because he could do this, he could conjure up the guardian spirit of people. And he offered to conjure up the guardian spirit of Plotinus so his students could see. And so Plotinus, to humor everyone, occasionally would assent to these kinds of things. Usually he would just say, this is irrelevant. On this occasion, he assented to it, and then they had to find a purified space to do this in, because it had to be sanctified ground that had never been corrupted. And Rome at that time had about 2 million people. It was an unbelievably huge city. It was a megalopolis. They couldn't find any sacred ground in the city of Rome of 2 million people except one place. The courtyard of the Temple of Vesta was the only sacred ground in the whole city of Rome. Well, they went through the ritual, and when the guardian spirit occurred, it was of such a power that they could see that it was a god. It was God, and not anything lesser. This is the kind of story wisdom that was there in the Renaissance 500 years ago at the Villa Correggi, and this is the way Ficino would have taught the younger man Pico. And so Pico, in his 27 years of age, delivering this oration on the dignity of man, and he's trying to say that the dignity of man is that man, of all the things in creation, has the capacity to go anywhere and everywhere. That all things in existence have their place, they have their locus, they have their level at which they exist, at which they are real. But man does not have any particular limited place to be real. That man instead is this whole creative elevator shaft that goes to every floor in the universe. And the dignity of man resides in the fact that he's at home in this creative corridor on every level of the universe. He's at home wherever he is. And he says, just as that first form of magic, that evil magic, that regressive magic makes man a slave and a pawn of evil powers, the latter makes him Lord and Master. That first form of magic cannot justify any claim to being either an art or a science. Well, the other magic is art. It is science. That's what it's all about. And art and science are the differential modes of reality. And when a human being is real in art, he is a person. And when a human being is real in science, he is the cosmos. And that's as real as this table. That's as eternal and solid as anything ever gets. And so he's saying, Pico, 500 years ago, 27 years. Fantastic. This beneficent magic in calling forth, as it were, from their hiding places into the light, the powers which the gift of God has sown and planted in the world, does not itself work miracles so much as sedulously serve nature as she works her wonders, scrutinizing with greater penetration that harmony of the universe which the Greeks with greater aptness of terms called sympatheia, and grasping the mutual affinity of things, she applies to each thing those inducements most suited to bringing their nature out and bringing them together. Sympatheia, sympathy. Sympathy is that power, that differential power of similarity working, and it's completely different from the power of identity. Similarity was known as sympathy when vision was known as magic. And since identity is the cornerstone of logic, and similarity is different in mode to identity. For example, equations. Equations are essentially integral identifiers. A equals A, an equation. X equals 6, an equation. But the archetypal equation behind all equations that work, any equation that can work, has an archetypal form which it participates with, to use the ancient language. And if it doesn't, there's no way to solve, there's no way to even function. What's the archetypal equation? X equals 0. If x equals 0, then we can work with x, and then 0 is displaced as x becomes what it is. 0 becomes equal to it. The old Tolstoy, when he was 82 years of age, and he had been possessed by this wide-eyed vision for about 30 years. Tolstoy, when he was younger, was a military officer. He was a swashbuckler. He was like Pico. He fought in where the Chechnya thing is when he was a young man. The Russians 150 years ago were fighting the same people over the same issues. And Tolstoy, who was so taken by the absolute courage of the Caucasus individual man, able to just function without any kind of support whatsoever, wrote a short story called Haji Mirage about the incredible, iridescent courageousness of the human spirit that one person is capable of. And that short story is one of the world's great short stories. But that Tolstoy, the Tolstoy who was not only the proud soldier, but he wrote the great epics of War and Peace and Anna Karenina, that Tolstoy, in his pride, Count Tolstoy, world-famous author, tough guy, participated in an aristocratic exercise one time in Moscow. And it fell to Tolstoy to help with the census. They were counting people in Moscow. And the section of Moscow that Tolstoy oversaw the counting of were the slums of Moscow. And day after day, week after week, month after month, Tolstoy, the illustrious, world-famous Count Tolstoy, seeing how human beings live in that nightmare squalor of permanent poverty in the slums, broke. His nice little etiquette of his aristocratic upbringing broke. And he wept with such a torrent that he simply couldn't stop. And his wife had to hide every gun and every knife in the place, because all he wanted to do was end it. End the tears that would not end, because the misery to which some human beings allow other human beings to sink to is unholy. And once one knows that, there's no relief. But the old Tolstoy, 30 years later, having gotten used to endless grief, was writing in his diary. And you can still see it. One of the last pages before he realized that he had to leave home, leave Yasnaya Polyana forever, and go out on the road, because that was the only thing to do. And he died in a railway station at Ostapovo on his way, making a pilgrimage into nowhere. One of the last pages of his diary, he writes, and in English translation it says, "I've finally learned how to write the name of God. God can only be expressed by a ratio, x/0. The unknown to be found over the unknown that is there." So behind every equation that every high school student uses, every civil engineer uses to build bridges that stay up, is the archetypal x=0. If that didn't hold, nothing else derived from that would hold. And the fact that it does hold, the Golden Gate Bridge stays up, high school students pass their exams, and the universe happens because there's something real to know. And knowing it, whatever you do from that is real. Well, you can make a person as real as eternity, and you can make a cosmos as actual as anything. But it's something to be done and not just guessed at. And that takes an education. And that's what's going on here. So equations are essentially integral identifiers. But there are two kinds of equations. There are integral equations and there are differential equations. And they both work equally as exacting. And in the differential, there's a pair. There's a variety. There are ordinary differential equations, and there are partial differential equations. The difference is in the number of variables. Notice that a differential equation takes into account variability. If there's one variable, then it's a differential equation of the ordinary sort. If there are more than one variable, it's a partial differential equation. So if you take yourself to Caltech or UCLA or wherever you would like to go to view mathematical texts, and you look at the beginnings of mathematical education for anybody in the whole world, no matter what language or culture they're from, they will have to study, most likely, one of the biggest areas is partial differential equations. It's a real bugbear. You have to really know your shit to deal with partial differential equations, because there's a lot happening. Well, life is a partial differential equation of infinite variables. And you can be taught to master that kind of mathematics. But not over there or over there, because they don't offer those courses. Equations are essentially integral identifiers, but differential equations related to integral equations are functions and derivatives involving one or more variables. Thus, similarity. Similarity is the cornerstone of vision. Or as they used to say, sympathy is the cornerstone of magic. Magia, from the old Iranian. The ancient Iranian is that the magi, the magia, understood that the sun is the center, but the field in which life occurs is light. So one has to deal with the gestalts in the light and not just with the sun. You can't just worship the sun. Part of an adjunct of worshiping the sun is understanding the efficacy of the gestalts that happen in the tensions of light. Because light and darkness, being creative opposites, produce tensions, and in those tension waves, that's the energy field in which existence can happen. That's how atoms get to be atoms. That's how molecules get to be molecules. And somebody who doesn't know that has no right to teach. "54-year-old Pico," right? Maybe I'll write them all down and post them in the city hall. Anybody, anytime, on any issue, step forth. Yeah, maybe in the 23rd century. So that logic and magic have cornerstones, and those cornerstones, lo and behold, fit together just like two hands. Just like two hands. The Greek symbol of the two hands fitting together like that, and the interlocking geometric, like that, that was the border that was used in places like the Parthenon. The Parthenon is not dedicated to Athena, the virgin, so much as Athena, the perfect woman. And her continuity symbol are the two hands locked together like that. They'll hold forever. When he realized that as a young man, Frank Lloyd Wright took that as his symbol, the interlocking hands of Athena. And he put that on the bottom in red so it would stand out like a Japanese seal or Chinese seal, like a chop. He put that infinity sign of Athena at the bottom of every sketch, of every architectural plan. Louis Sullivan, looking over his shoulder with his cigar, said, "Right, now you're learning how to build." Because behind every building that you see is a man that you don't see, but he's the one who made that building. Before a building can be real, an architect has to be real to himself. They collected a bunch of Louis Sullivan's little quips and sayings together one time, and they published it in New York, a bunch of avant-garde artists, and they called it Kindergarten Chats. Before you guys are fancy architects with the big offices and all the big commissions, here's a few things in kindergarten that you should know. Someone, the young Hugh Downs, interviewing the old Frank Lloyd Wright. He was about 89 years old. And Hugh Downs said, well, Mr. Wright, everyone calls you arrogant. What do you think of that? And Wright looked at him without flinching. He said, you know, I had a choice when I was a young man between hypocritical humility and honest arrogance. He said, I think I made the right choice. He said, I think my work occupies the center line of architecture. And anytime anyone is going to build for real, they'll come back to the center line. My work will be there, and I can use it. So it was his reply. Logic and magic are curiously related. They're like that symbol of Athena. And just like that symbol, in its rendition on the Parthenon, it runs as a ribbon. It's a ribbon of continuity. It's not just that, but it's that continuously. Before the Greeks had it that way, the way that the ancient Greeks, the archaic Greeks, older than ancient is archaic. And there were classical Greeks like Plato, and there were ancient Greeks like Homer, and then there were archaic Greeks who were there when the Greek language was written in such a way that people didn't even recognize that it was Greek until the 1950s. In the 1950s, they recognized that middle Greek, between ancient and archaic, was written in a script that they call Linear B. In fact, it was an architect, Michael Ventris, who deciphered it, who realized that Linear B was a very old form of ancient Greek. And then they found that an even older form was called Linear A. And that Linear A was written and spoken more than 4,000 years ago. And at that time, the symbol was not the hands brought together like this in a geometric linking and locking, but the symbol at that time was a series of waves. Water and sky together, interlocking by a series of infinite waves, because it was an energy, vibration, flow of earth and sky. Because those archaic Greeks, the Mycenaean Minoans, were famous because they were free, they were mobile on open water with only sky and water. Because they had learned, like the Phoenicians and the Polynesians, they had learned to be free by seeing the cosmos in their vision so that they could navigate out of sight of land. Very, very few people could do that. To navigate out of sight of land, when you don't know the water currents, you don't know the wind capacities, you have to have some way to navigate. You have to be able to see the cosmos in terms of gestalts, in terms of constellations. And when you can constellate the stars into gestalts and know how they move, then you can go out on open water outside of land, and you can go where you'd like to go. Then you have freedom, and you have mobility. Part of the difficulty of going to our other star systems is that the constellations change. How do you know where you are? Oh, it doesn't change very much. If you went to Alpha Centauri, it's only 4 light years away. But if you went more than 1,600 light years, you wouldn't recognize a thing. If you went to the constellation of Orion, If you went to the other star and the top of Orion, if you went to Bellatrix, none of the constellations would be there that you knew, ever. And be completely different. And that's only this galaxy. It's only this little wedge of this galaxy. And if you were in other dimensions of some galaxy 8 billion light years away, you have to know a lot of constellations to navigate in God's world. And if you're just all the time associating 12 constellations with the totality, well, you're a loser. Unless you stay in your sandbox. To even deal with this simple little planet, you need 88 constellations, just for openers. So if you know 12, well, you've got a beginning. But you've got 76 more to go before you can even start to talk about planetary. And that's just kindergarten chats. So there's no sense in getting huffy, is there? It's like the old bull said, let's take our time and notice that logic and magic, the closer they come together, the more they fit together and become a ribbon. They become a continuity. And in fact, in physics, it's called a continuum. Logic and magic are a continuum in realization. But the further you move away from realization, the point, the moment, we had a lecture 3 weeks ago called The Golden Moment. The more that one goes on either side of the golden moment, the more that logic and magic become inversely proportional to each other. The more they become separated and work oppositely. And the farthest that one could spread logic and magic, the most that the equinoxes of logic and magic, of integral and differential, the farthest away that they spread is ritual and art. Nothing is more opposed in this universe than art and ritual. Good ritual is exactly inversely proportionally opposite to good art. And yet they are at the root and at the crown related to each other in such a way that if someone were really capable of realization, you could draw a diagrammatic continuity between the two. Like a Picasso. But not a shaman. There's no way from the apex of nature to enter into the apex of vision. No way. And so last week's lecture was about a metaphor of how that happens in our body, because people like Pico and Ficino, and they said man is a microcosm. Actually, it's a line from one of Plato's dialogues, the Protagoras. Protagoras was a fancy sophist of his day. He's kind of like the well-dressed, well-financed guy. Every place that he went, everybody was, I don't want to name any names. We have a lot of that today in our world, right? Ooh, bestsellers. Ooh, world famous. Well, they never heard of you on Mars, much less other star systems. You know what their reply is? My agent will inquire about royalties. Protagoras said, man is the measure of all things. But notice that a sophist, a beautiful, well-dressed sophist in Plato's time saying man is the measure of all things is egotistical. Whereas what people like Pico meant is that the mobility of man is that it allows him to function in a dynamic way, so that in functioning in that way completely, then he is the measure of all things. But he's not the measure of all things just sitting on his ass in his comfortable chair of fame, fortune, sending out billing. That's not it. It's like our friend Herman Melville in Moby Dick. He says there's all the difference in the world. When you're on a long ocean voyage, there's all the difference in the world between paying for it and being paid. That's why he wanted to be a member of the crew. You can go and do all that, but you're being paid. It's a whole different thing. The creative aspect of life is that you're being paid, not in bucks, but in valuation. Now that valuation is based upon a currency mode called the real. And what happens then is real, not just speculative, not metaphysically. Actually happens. Actual births happen. Actual deaths, actual rebirths, actual love. For real. But that quality here, where integration and differentiation are together, that continuity, called a continuum in modern physics, that's where time, space, and nature meet consciousness. And when time, space, consciousness are a continuum, then you get a dimensional sphericality that is capable of delivering gestalts that hold transcendentally to just time-space. It isn't that time-space fit together and are a continuum. It's that time-space consciousness form a continuum. And on that continuum, whatever gestalts are made are eternal. Rembrandt has a famous painting, not the one that one of the ones that the Getty just bought, but another one that nobody's selling. And Nebuchadnezzar, the painting that they had is misnamed. It's not Daniel and Cyrus. Cyrus lived many generations, 3 generations after Daniel. It was Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar. And the old Rembrandt has this painting of Nebuchadnezzar looking up in stark horror. He's the most powerful king of his time, and next to him is Daniel, and he's looking with great visionary exactness. And there behind Nebuchadnezzar, all he can see is this glowing burst of energy. It frightens him. But Daniel sees in the glowing burst of energy words of God written with God's finger, because God writes in light like we would write in sand. And those words are the words that will be the promised transformation of the exile into a rebirth in the promised land for his grandchildren. And Daniel can read that, and he understands. We're not going to go there, but our grandchildren are going to get to go home in a better way than which we had to leave it. And he's content to do that. And you can see that Rembrandt puts that beautiful, patient determinism in the young Daniel. And all Nebuchadnezzar sees is his egotistical fearfulness, because there's a power that he doesn't even know is there. And suddenly it's just a blur in front of him. Nebuchadnezzar's eyes are blind because he gets blinded by trying to look at the light as a thing. These eyes don't look at light as a thing, but take it all in as a vision. It says in Genesis very, very simply, no man has looked upon the face of God. But the community as a whole, they can show the true face. That's why the purity of the community was so important. Why? Because the community was the metaphor of a shared vision that no one ego holds, but that the community as a whole holds. That's why a synagogue does not belong to the rabbi. It belongs to the congregation. I don't care what yeshiva you studied in. It belongs to the congregation. No one doesn't even have to argue the point. It's evident. There's a lot of false teaching everywhere, and the time to pull the plug is coming. Because logic and magic are only continuous in realization. The more that one goes on either side of it, the more one goes back into the integral qualities or on into the differential qualities, the more opposite they become inversely proportional. So that at its greatest extent, ritual and art are completely diametrically opposed. To be an artist, you must forget ritual completely. But to be in very real ritual, you have to let go art completely. But to be a human being fully, one has to be able to go into the ecology of not only these two, but all the oceanic spreads of earth and sky. It should be water and sky, I guess. In between. That is what an education should deliver. And those are not kind of cross your fingers, future hopeful specks. Those are the ancient foundations upon which human beings, men and women, can be brought into their own in a world that's real. Now we have a technique that we're using. We're using pairs of books because in this pairedness, it enables us to see constantly, to keep reminding ourselves constantly that what we're dealing with here is like a caliper action. And that as we keep that sense of a caliper action in whatever it is that we're doing and looking for, it becomes easier and easier for us to be ambidextrous spontaneously. And the sign of a really well-educated man or woman is that they are spontaneously ambidextrous in face of something new. Intelligence is the ability to work from scratch and develop spontaneously a living relationality with the unknown as it occurs. That's the intelligence quotient, not some kind of choice test on pieces of paper. It's bad grammar. You get the point. The pair of books we're working with starting this week are two, one by a man, one by a woman, one by Carl Jung, Alchemical Studies, the other, The Art of Memory, by Francis Yates. I'll talk next week about The Art of Memory, and if some of you want to read ahead and overshadow and give really good criticism and pick out all my errors, well, there's a beautiful study by Mary Carruthers, just published by Cambridge University Press, The Book of Memory, a study of memory in medieval culture. I haven't read it yet, so you could read this ahead of time and waylay me next week. And that'll be interesting for me to deal with something completely new, right? You have to buy your own copy. It's a $35 paperback. But it might be worth it to someone. As Pico once said, I need the work.